Back live with you tonight, here on In Focus, and thanks for staying on. Now, numerous experts have been weighing in on the recent severe weather seen in KwaZulu-Natal and the Western Cape, saying that this is part of a new reality due to global warming. Well, just yesterday, one person died in KwaZulu-Natal after flooding and a tornado that lashed that part of South Africa. University of KwaZulu-Natal climate change lecturer, Professor Tafadzwanashe Mabhaudhi joins us now for more on that conversation. Prof, good evening. Good to have you, and thank you very much for coming on. Before we get into the maybe the modeling, forecasting models and our country's response and so on and so forth, just for somebody who doesn't understand what is happening in this space, this weather system that is causing these extreme events, is it something that is unique to South Africa, or is it something that is happening elsewhere, or is it related to what is happening elsewhere? And is the occurrence, or shall I say the occurrences that we're seeing, something that could be expected to stay and happen quite frequently?
So the weather system that we're experiencing is a natural weather system that typically happens at this time of the year, both in the Western Cape as well as in KwaZulu-Natal. So it's a natural weather system that is happening. The tornado that we had yesterday was also a storm that originated at ocean and then hit land in the afternoon, causing the destruction that we had. So weather is a natural phenomenon. Climate change comes into now when we say what is the likelihood of this event having happened, and what we then look at is how climate change is increasing the likelihood of extreme weather events.
Yeah, so it's a natural weather system that occurs in nature, but it's always asked as to whether or not do we fully understand the climate risks that are attached to this weather system and it happening so frequently.
Yeah, so what climate change is basically doing, it's not creating new weather per se, but it's increasing the intensity and frequency of these extremes and the probability of those extremes happening in certain places. So that's the climate change effect, the human-induced climate change effect. And what we have to prepare for is the fact that these events are going to happen more frequently, and the intensity that they are going to have is going to be increasing over time, which is something that we've been experiencing a lot of late. Yeah.
As far as our forecasting models are concerned, how well are we doing there? And then we'll touch on our response in a moment. But as far as being able to forecast these kind of events from happening, the science that is behind it, how well is South Africa equipped to be able to do that?
So the science is world class. The South African Weather Service relies on global models to inform its own modeling and forecast. So even for yesterday, the tornado that hit, they had observed it, they picked it up, they were monitoring it, they sent warnings around 1 p.m. in the afternoon. They were warning that it is going to hit land. They issued out warnings for the torrential rainfall based on their impact-based warning system. The challenge that we have is the dissemination of the warning to the most affected people, the building of response capabilities so that the people know what to do when a warning is issued. Do we have the capacity within our disaster management centers in local municipalities to be able to respond and mitigate the disaster aspect of these weather extremes? So it's preparedness and response capabilities that are really lacking in South Africa.
Yeah. What is climate risk, Prof, and why does it matter?
So climate risk matters. So we've got climate hazards. So let's say, for example, a flood, it's a hazard. And then you've got exposure. Exposure is then looking at the people or the assets that are located within the area that will be affected. And then you consider the vulnerability of the people located in the exposure zone. And because of poverty in South Africa, because of a lot of informal settlements and our history and legacy and so forth, we've got a very high number of people who are exposed and vulnerable to climate risks, which means when these hazards happen, they easily become disasters and there's significant loss of life and property. And what we need to do is to be protecting property and lives especially, so that we do not continue to lose lives in the event of these extremes happening.
Yeah, and how, okay, we'll come to the how do we do that. I mean, certainly this will have financial consequences. I mean, there's no doubt about it, and might even begin to affect the financial performance of the country. I mean, the aftermath of these things, every time they measure it, they're measuring it in billions. That needs to go into rebuilding these communities and so on and so forth. I suppose money that could have also been used in other much needed service delivery areas in the country. Are we budgeting correctly? Can we budget correctly for these events?
So the challenge is we have not been budgeting correctly for the longest time. If we had been budgeting correctly for the longest time, we would have climate-proofed a lot of settlements, would have climate-proofed, cities, would have come up with climate-resilient infrastructure, would have put in place early warning systems in place, and built the capacity of people, resourced disaster management centers, and so forth. So for the longest time, we've not been budgeting effectively. What we do very well is the response, that when the damage has happened, we then come in, help relocate people, help with infrastructure. But even that, again, if the scale of the disaster is significant. For example, in KwaZulu-Natal, we've not really recovered from the infrastructure damage from the April floods of 2022. A lot of infrastructure is still to be repaired. A lot of people are still stranded without proper accommodation. So we have not budgeted well up until now. And the amounts that are needed now, my assessment is it's actually beyond our capacity. And there's a huge need for, international climate finance to come in and show up the efforts that people are making on the ground. Yeah.
What we see very clearly is the impact on the lives because, of course, people are displaced, homes are flooded, people are losing beds, fridges, food, and so on and so forth. As you mentioned, infrastructure, bridges are destroyed, service provision becomes an issue, and I suppose the economy also gets affected. But what we have not maybe properly even deeply articulated is the impact on livelihoods, on people's ability to work, and how their employment situation becomes affected by these events.
That is actually the biggest impact and the biggest negative impact, really. And I think when we talk about the impact on livelihoods, we also have to look at where the majority of South Africans are in terms of unemployment, inequality, and poverty. And also that, the poor are disproportionately affected or impacted by these hazards. If you saw this tornado yesterday, the pictures and videos that you're seeing are of informal settlements, roof being blown away. So it's the poorest of the poor who are losing accommodation and shelter. It's the poorest of the poor who lose employment and cannot earn a living. It's the poorest of the poor who are faced with tough decisions in terms of how to survive and how to recover after an incident has happened. So it actually comes in and worsens or creates a very vicious cycle of, around existing issues of poverty, inequality, and unemployment. It's really worsening the situation. And last year, the damage that happened in KwaZulu-Natal, the industries that shut down, a lot have not reopened. Employment that was lost has not been recovered. Families that lost income have not regained those sources of income. And it's pushing people further into poverty. So it's really an important aspect to understand what it means at a people level.
Yeah. And the other question, of course, is the question on health. How do events of this nature impact on health? I mean, for example, we've seen in eThekwini their inability to fix their sanitation infrastructure following the floods. And one would be talking cholera now. If sicknesses and illnesses like that could in any way be related to severe weather systems.
On health in several dimensions. There's the obvious one that you are mentioning, where we've got damage to wastewater treatments, and you've got sewage flowing into rivers and water pollution, which then creates incidents of waterborne diseases, cholera being one of them. There's also instances of when you've got water sitting idle in certain places, it creates a breeding space or place for mosquitoes. And you've got malaria. It's also a risk, a health risk in low-lying areas. You've also got other extremes such as heat. You've got heat stress, and we are getting an increasing number of very hot days, and you get incidences of heat strokes, people dying because of heat strokes. We've done research at the University of KwaZulu-Natal that has also shown that natural disasters are associated with. So there's a mental health aspect to it also that shows that areas that are impacted by natural disasters have a higher likelihood and incidence of people being affected by depression. And you can understand that if you lose your source of livelihood, if you lose your home, if you can't fend for your family, put food on the table, it can create mental stress and mental disorders in that sense. So there's a huge health implication to the issue of natural disasters.
And finally, as we wrap up, Prof, I mean, if we are to respond to this properly, I spoke to one of the deputy city managers, particularly looking at crisis management in KwaZulu-Natal, disaster management. And he says, well, we've had colloquiums, we've sat around the table, we've spoken to experts. For example, they've spoken to us around the speed of how we respond. They've spoken to us, for example, around infrastructure, where we build, and so on and so forth. Is that the kind of approach we should be taking, or is there a complete change of how we need to think, particularly around these severely affected areas, in how we're going to respond to this challenge as it continues to happen frequently?
I think there needs to be a whole paradigm shift in terms of how we deal with and respond to the agency of climate change and its impacts on people. We need to understand the complexity and cross-cutting nature of climate change. We've just talked now about, climate change and linked it to livelihoods, linked it to health, linked it to the economy, and many other different dimensions. So that tells us that it is complex, it is cross-cutting, and what it requires are integrated solutions. So it's not just about fixing infrastructure. It's about, coming up with climate-sensitive infrastructure designs. It's about climate-sensitive spatial planning that ensures that people are not located in harm's way. It's about, ecological infrastructure, rebuilding the environment so that it plays its role in buffering, some of these disasters. It's about building capacities in terms of early warnings, the response capabilities, and building capacity at very local levels, community-based, response capabilities, because that is where the impact is felt at a local level, and that's where the capacity needs to be invested in at a very local level. So it requires, a call for action from a broad range of stakeholders, and I think from the media as well, yourselves, you as the media or as the fourth estate have an obligation to build and create awareness around climate change and the agency, and to put pressure on decision makers so that decisions are made quickly, and to ensure that the conversation stays on people's minds. And it's not just a conversation we should have when there are disasters, it's a conversation we should be having, especially when there are no disasters, so that we are building that preparedness to mitigate the disasters when they eventually happen.
Prof, we appreciate your time. Thanks so much for joining us. Coming all the way from Malawi there, that's Professor Tafadzwanashe Mabhaudhi.